Alright, hey guys, I'm back today with another tutorial. Today we're going to be doing kind of a beginner's scene in Blender. So when I first started 3D, one of the, if not the first tutorial I did was some kind of snowman in Blender, and I believe it was like Blender 2.37, and it just kind of showed me the ropes. So I figured I'd create a snowman tutorial. You know, it's cold outside and just kind of in the mood for this type of thing. I recommend that you have some level of knowledge navigating Blender, know a thing or two about it. You know, you can still be very entry level and do this tutorial. I'm going to attempt to explain as much as possible, and we're just going to dive right in and try and create the scene. So we'll start off by modeling the snowman, setting up the textures, setting up the shaders, setting up the background. We'll do a little bit of sculpting, a little bit of particles, and we'll wrap up in the end with compositing the scene. So yeah, let's just dive right in. Alright, so before we get too far ahead, I did want to show you this is what the scene looks like. I'll turn on rendered mode. We're going to be using cycles. There we go. So yeah, it'll look something like this when we're done. Everything in this tutorial is made in Blender, minus a couple of textures. I'll show you where you can download them for free. Okay, so before we go into Blender, let's create a folder hierarchy so we stay organized. You see I have my Blender folder, I have a new folder called Snow Tutorial, and then I have a textures folder. So what I generally do is I drop my blend file here in the Snow Tutorial folder, and then in the textures folder, we'll download and drop all of our textures. Alright, so I have a new blend file open, ready to go. This is my default scene. As you can see, I have the default cube here. To rotate around, I'm just clicking the middle mouse button and moving the mouse around. A couple of quick notes, just going to go over some controls real quick. This is a beginner tutorial. I do expect you to know some things, but just in case you don't, to move this object around, we'll press the G key. G stands for grab. Move the mouse around. If I right click, it gets put back to where it was. If I left click, it goes to wherever I place it. If I want to move this along a certain axis, I can press G and Z and it'll be constrained to the Z axis. G and Y and it'll be constrained to the Y axis, or G and X and it'll be constrained to the X axis. Alternatively, I can also start moving it in a certain direction on the Z-axis. Click the middle mouse button and it will constrain to that axis. Let's go ahead and delete this. I'm going to go ahead and add in a UV sphere. I'm going to right click it, shade smooth. And in Blender you have these things called modifiers. Modifiers can affect the mesh in different ways, so let's go ahead and let's add this subdivision surface modifier to this UV sphere. As you can see, the UV sphere automatically became a lot smoother. Let me remove it real quick. See, it's a little bit more jaggedy here. As soon as I add subdivision surface, it's a lot smoother. Okay? So this sphere will be the base of our snowman. I'm going to go ahead and move it up on the Z-axis. Somewhere around there, I guess. Let's actually go into Sculpt Mode. I'm going to rough this up a little bit. At the top, you have these different modes for Blender. Layout, sculpting, shading. Right now, we're going to go into Sculpt Mode. I'm just going to use the default brush, the draw brush. I'm going to go over to Symmetry. Turn off mirroring. So we all know that a snowman's not going to be perfectly round, so I'm just going to mess it up a little bit. If I click on the model, you can see the draw brush is changing the surface. If I hold down Control, it'll cut into it. You can control different brush parameters right here on the right, such as radius and strength. Okay, this is probably okay. I'm gonna go back to layout mode. Now I'm gonna duplicate this to make the middle of the snowman. I'll just hit Shift D, move it up on the Z axis. I can press S to scale it, and I'll drop it down a little bit. I'm gonna press R to rotate. And now I'm going to press Shift D again to make the third segment. I'm going to scale it again by pressing S. Lower it. I can actually double tap R and rotate it based on mouse movement. Do something like that. Okay, so now we have kind of a basic snowman. Let's go ahead and add the ground. I'll add a mesh plane right here. I'll hit S to scale it up. I'm going to hit Tab to go into edit mode. If I go to Edge, I can pick Subdivide. And you can see that's divided the plane into 4 segments. I'm going to hit it again. Edge, Subdivide. It's divided again. I'm going to do this a few more times. Okay, so now I have a lot more geometry. I'm now going to click one of these vertices and I'm going to move it up. However, this isn't really what I want. So I'm going to enable proportional editing mode. You can click on this right here, or you can just press the O key. You have different modes of proportional editing right here. I'm just going to keep the default for now. When I hit G, you see there's a circle here. I can scroll my middle mouse wheel to affect different areas of geometry. Also right click Shade Smooth, and I'll probably just go and sculpt this a little bit also. I'm just roughing up the terrain a little bit. Back to layout. Want to make sure the snowman doesn't look like he's floating. Okay, that's probably good. Now, this is looking kind of rough, so I'm going to go ahead and add that Subdivision surface modifier to it. That looks a little smoother. Okay, so now we're ready to start working on our shaders. What we're going to need to do is download a few files. Okay, so since we want to make our textures now, we need to download a few textures. So head on over to textures.com, make a free account. They'll give you a few credits and you can download some textures. The first one is snow. So go to the top, type in snow, pick one that you like, or use the one I used, which was this one right here. It's called 3D Scan Snow 2x2 meters. I used the albedo map, the medium size 1024 by 1024, the normal map medium, and the roughness medium 1024 by 1024. Go ahead and download those 3 textures, put them in your textures folder. Next, go to the top, type in stick. And I used the free texture right here. This won't count against your credits. And you can also download at the highest resolution since it's free. So let's click on that. Download the 4K albedo map, the 4K normal map, the 4K roughness map, and the 4K alpha map. Put those in your textures folder. And finally, we need our HDRI environment background. So I got that from HDRI Haven. This is a great site with free HDRIs. Go over here to HDRIs at the top. And let's run a search here for snow. And I used Snowy Park 01. I used the 4K version, but you can download whatever you want. You can even use a different HDRI if you want. You don't even have to use snow. It's up to you. But that's what I used. Let's go back to Blender. Alright, so now we have our textures downloaded. We can start working on our shaders. First thing we need to do is switch our render mode to cycles. By default, it's on EV. So we can go here to the Render Properties tab. Just change the drop down to cycles. I'm going to change mine to GPU. That way my GPU will render the scene. Up at the top here, I'm going to click Shading. This is where we'll build our shaders. So I'm going to pick the base of the snowman. I'm going to click New. I'm going to call this Snow. And we're going to import the image textures we just downloaded. So I'll go here to Add, and I'll hit Texture, Image Texture. I'm going to hit Open. And I'm going to load in the snow texture. So here's the albedo. We'll drag the color node to base color on the principal BSDF shader. I'm just going to go ahead and duplicate this and duplicate it again. So now we have 3 of them. I'm going to open up the roughness map. I'm going to drag that color node to the roughness slider. And then for this one, I'm going to open up the normal map. I'm going to go ahead and add a vector normal map node. I'll take the color information from this node, attach it here, and then I'll take this normal node and I'll attach it to the normal node section of the principal BSDF shader. As you can see now, we're getting normal data, albedo data, and roughness data. So to break this down, the albedo is kind of like the color map information. It's just the color of the model. The roughness controls how smooth the model is. Basically, the smoother an object is, the more shiny / reflective it gets. The more rough it is, the more coarse it looks. We're just using this map to control the value. If I wanted to illustrate that, I'll just disconnect this real quick. Now if I turn roughness all the way down, that makes it really, really smooth. You can see now it's very, very shiny. If I turn the roughness all the way up, it almost looks like chalk. So once again, we're going to use this map to control that. There we go. And a normal map is used to change the look of the surface of a model. They're frequently used to add more detail. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and apply this shader to the other parts of the snowman. So we'll click the middle base. We'll click this little drop down here. We'll pick snow. And then we'll do the same for the top. Now the entire snowman is textured. Let's apply this to the ground also. There we go. Okay, now let's take a look at this in previewed render mode. We'll go up to the top and we'll change our viewport shading to render preview. And we can see this doesn't look quite right. So let's go here. Let's change our normal map color space to non-color. That looks a lot better. Now, if you notice, when I changed it on one, it changed on all of them because I've applied that same shader to every object in the scene. This means if I edit one, they will all change. For example, if I change this color to red, all of them will change to red. Okay, so there's one more thing we need to do, and that's get our background in Blender. Remember that HDRI we downloaded? We're about to load that in now. let's change from object mode to world mode right here. And just like we created our image textures, we're going to do the same thing, except we'll pick environment texture instead of image texture. We'll go ahead and open that Hdri file. We'll drag the color node to color on background right there. And there we go. The Hdri has loaded in the background, and it's also casting light on the scene. If we change the world properties right here, we can actually adjust the strength of the background. You can see right now it's set to 1. Let's change it to 2. And it immediately became brighter. I'm going to go ahead and change this back to 1. Let's go to layout mode. Now I want to go ahead and position the camera. The way I like to do this is I like to split the screen in half. So as you can see, when I mouse over this line right here, I get this double arrow. I right click, I hit vertical split, and now I can split the screen in half, just like that. I change one side to rendered mode. And then this little object right here is the camera. If I press 0 on the numpad, I'll end up looking through the camera. Now here on the right side, I'm still free to operate and work like I usually would, while I can watch the preview on the left side. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move the camera around just to adjust my view and try and line up my shot the way I might want it. Okay, so something like that's good. Okay, this sphere right here that I just clicked on is a lamp. As you can see, when I move it around, the light affects the scene. However, I don't want this light in our scene, so I'm just going to hit X and delete it. I'm going to go ahead and add in a sun lamp instead. The sun lamp appears in the middle of our scene. The first thing I'm going to do is go over here to the object data properties. I'm going to increase the strength to 3. I'm going to raise it up. You'll see it's adjusting the lighting of the scene as I move it. And I'm going to adjust it to my liking. So basically I'm using this sun lamp to try and get more interesting shadows out of the scene by adjusting the angle, and I've already adjusted the intensity. Okay, so something like this looks alright. The next thing I want to do is I want to make this landmass look a little bit more interesting, give a little more shape to it, so I'm just going to keep editing it like I was earlier. Okay, so now the biggest problem we have is that the background is not meshing with the floor plane very well. To fix this, we're going to have to create a new image. Let's go over to Texture Paint mode. Texture Paint mode, we can literally create our own textures from scratch. I'm going to go to Image. I'm going to click New. And I'm going to call it Floor Alpha. The default 1024 pixels by 1024 is fine. We'll leave Alpha checked and we'll click OK. Now, I'm going to right click and I'm going to increase my radius to maybe around 400 pixels. Doesn't have to be perfect. We make sure that white is the color that is selected. And I'm just going to create basically a white circle in the middle with blurry edges. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you do not want it to run off the edge like that. You want the whole edge to be black. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and go to Image, and I'm going to save this texture. Alright, so now that that's saved, let's go back to Shading. Let's pick the floor. And remember how earlier I said if I edit this shader, it's going to edit for all of the objects it's applied to. We're going to fix that now. If you're still seeing the environment shader, go back right here and change it from world to object. Once again, make sure that you have the floor selected. Go over here to the Material Properties tab, and notice there's a 4 next to the name of the material. That's because this shader is applied to 4 different objects. If I click it, it's going to rename it to snow.0001. That means it's basically duplicated that material. It's applied the new duplicate to the floor plane. Now we're free to edit this shader without compromising the other models. Let's rename this to Snow Floor. And let's edit the shader by adding a new image texture. I'm going to go to Texture, Image Texture, and I'm going to load the image we just created. Alright, so we have our floor alpha texture loaded. Let's go ahead and drag color to alpha. Now if you notice, the edges of this mesh have faded away. It's literally using the alpha map to control the transparency of this model. Let's go back to texture paint. So the white part is fully visible while the black part is transparent, and then the in-between part here is faded. As we can see, when we go back to the layout, we're getting a much better transition between the floor plane and the background. I'm going to edit this slightly to help with that effect. So basically, I just didn't want the hard edges here. I want the faded transparent portion to kind of blend in with the background. Now it's kind of hard to tell where the mesh ends and where the background image begins, where that Hdri begins, which is kind of what we wanted. Don't forget to save your file frequently because Blender will crash. Alright, so next we're going to work on the arms. If you recall, in our original image we had sticks for arms and we downloaded those stick textures. Now we're going to make use of them. Let's go ahead and add in a plane. I'm just going to move it up real quick. I'm going to hit tab and go to edit mode. I'm going to hit S and let's turn off proportional edit mode. I'm going to hit S and X. I'm going to make it thin. Now I'm going to go to shading, and we're going to make a new shader for this arm. I'm going to hit new. I'm going to call it arm, and we're going to load in our stick textures. Let's go to texture, image, exactly like we did before. We're going to load in, this time, 4 textures. I'm just hitting Shift D to duplicate. Now I have 4 image texture nodes. Alright, so I have my 4 textures loaded. I'm going to drag the albedo map to the base color node. I'm then going to drag color from the roughness map to the roughness slot on the principled BSDF. I'm then going to take the color node from the alpha map, or the transparency map, and I'm going to drag it to the alpha spot. Next, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add in vector normal map. Once again, I'm going to drag color from the normal map. Drop it right there. And then I'm going to attach the normal slot to the normal slot on the shader. And there we have it. Our stick texture shader is done, but we still have a little bit of work to do. As you can see, the entire map is being outputted onto this plane. So let's go and create a UV map. We'll go to UV editing right here. In the drop-down menu up here, let's go ahead and load the alpha map for the sticks. For me, I just think this is easier to see. Select the entire stick mesh and hit U and then unwrap. As you can see, here's the UV map. If we go back to shaded right here, you can see whatever is in this square here, or in this rectangle, is showing up here. If I move this, it's adjusting. So what we need to do is just pick one stick. So I'm going to rotate this, and I'm going to pick one that I like, which will probably be this one. I think it'll make an okay arm. Now we have one arm mesh created with the texture applied properly, and I'm just going to move this and put it in place manually. There we go. So now just using one plane, we have an image texture applied with an alpha map, and it looks like there's actually a stick sticking out of the base of the snowman. Let's go ahead and highlight it. Let's press Shift-D to duplicate it. We'll hit Tab to go into edit mode, highlight the entire thing, and then we're just gonna change which stick is selected. I'm thinking maybe we'll go with this top one. Just for some variety, you don't want to use the same one for both arms because that's not possible. And let's rotate this around. I'll scale it in a little bit. Maybe make it a little bit crooked. Let's see. All right, let's go back to layout mode. Let's take a look at this. All right, so this is how it's looking so far. We have our snowman, we have arms, we have the ground plane that's meshing pretty well with the HDRI. Let's keep moving. Now we're going to work on the stones. All right, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to add in a mesh UV sphere. Let's drag it up. Go and shrink it down a bit. Right click, shade smooth. And I think I'm going to press S for scale and X just to thin this out. We're making the little stones that we're going to place on the snowman for his buttons and his eyes and nose. Okay, let's go back to shading. As you can see, we still have, make sure you select your stone. Let's make a new shader right here, or a new material, and we'll just call it rock. Let's go ahead and change the base color to something darker. Let's go ahead and add in a vector normal map, and then let's also add texture, noise. Let's take the color node right here and attach it to the color socket on the normal map. Let's take the normal node socket and attach it to the normal socket here on the principal shader. Maybe we'll turn the strength up slightly to 4. Let's scale this up pretty high. Turn the roughness up a bit. Maybe turn the detail up. Okay, so this isn't a perfect rock, but it'll work for a faraway shot. I'm actually gonna tab into edit mode, and I'm just gonna edit this slightly with proportional editing mode, just to make it not as symmetrical. Okay. Let's go back to layout mode. And let's go ahead and rotate and place this rock on the base of the snowman. I'm just using R and G to position it the way I want. When I got it about where I want, I'll just hit Shift D to duplicate, and I'll move it again. And I'll position it for a second button. Feel free to rotate it and maybe even go into edit mode. Just change the shape up a little bit. Just so they don't look exactly the same. After that, I'm going to edit. I'm going to duplicate. And I'm going to add more rocks to the middle part. Alright, and now I'm going to make two eyes. I'm going to duplicate and make two eyes. Okay, and finally, just going to make a nose. Alright, let's go ahead and check the render preview. It looks pretty good, in my opinion. Not bad for, 15-minute snowman? Okay, so now in the final image, we had some snow falling. So we're going to go ahead and create a particle simulation for that. Let's go ahead and add a mesh plane. I'm going to go ahead and move it up above the snowman. I'm going to scale it out. So the particles are going to come out of this mesh and they're going to fall onto the snowman. Or, well, in the general scene, anyway. Let's go over here to particle properties. Let's add a new one. So we're going to go over here to render and we're going to pick object. So this means that the particles that fall out of this emitter will be object, something that we have created. So now we need to create a snowflake. Let's create a new plane, mesh plane. Going to move this up high again, and let's go to shading. Going to hit new, and I'm going to call this snowflake. Now I'm going to add the floor alpha texture that we created earlier because it basically could be reused for a snowflake. So we'll add image texture. We'll just use the drop down here. We'll pick floor alpha and we'll use the color and we'll drop it to alpha, and there we go. So now we have a snowflake. We can actually adjust the color a little bit. Maybe we'll make it a little bit darker. Yeah, we'll make it a little darker so it's easier to see. And let's go over to our scene collection here. Let's double click that plane.004. It may be different for you, but I'm going to call it snowflake so I keep track of it a little bit better. Let's click on our particle emitter again. Go back to the particle tab. And we'll go back to render. And where we picked render as object, we'll pick our instance object here. We'll choose snowflake. So this means it's going to make little copies of this snowflake mesh fall out of it. If I adjust the number here, let's change it to, say, 3000. And then let's change the scale here to maybe 0.5. We'll see how that is to start off with. Let's go back to layout. We have a little timeline down here. Let's go ahead and hit play. Now we see snowflakes are falling. They are way too big and they're facing the wrong way. So first, let's fix the rotation. Let's click our original snowflake, and let's just hit Edit Mode, tab to go into Edit Mode. Press R twice, and rotate it around until it's facing the right way. We can also scale it down here, so that'll help. But also, let's go back to our particle settings. Let's shrink it right here, maybe 2.3. We can also add some randomness here. I'm just going to turn this up all the way. So this is making them all look different because snowflakes aren't the same size. Okay. Another thing we can do is enable rotation. So we'll check that box there. And we'll just randomize it a little bit so they all rotate a little differently. Let's drag the slider on the timeline back to 0. Let's hit play again, and there we go. Let's pause it. So now we have random snowflakes falling. As you can see here in our scene, that looks pretty good. Okay, and one last thing we need to do is we need to turn this emitter off. I've currently got it positioned outside of the camera so you can't see it, but it's probably good practice to just uncheck this show emitter box, which means it just won't be rendered in the final render, period. This may cause you to have to replay your snowflake animation, so we'll drag back to the beginning, play animation, we'll pause again. All right, there we go. So pretty much anytime you make a change to your settings here, you're gonna want to start that animation over so the changes are reflected. I'm actually gonna highlight these eyes, nose, and head, and I want to rotate it a little bit to the camera just to line it up a little better. Okay. Now real quick, let's do a test render. So I've got my render engine set to cycles. GPU compute. If we go here to output properties, you can see I'm rendering in 1080p. Let's hit F12 to render. Alright, so this render took about 40 seconds, which isn't bad. It's a little overexposed. There's a lot of white here, but we're going to clean some of that up. I think overall, though, it's pretty decent. One of the main issues I see is that the 3D model is too sharp against the background, so we'll fix that too. Let's go ahead and hit escape to go back to Blender, and let's go to compositing at the top. So first there won't be anything here, so we can go ahead and check this use node box, and now we can see here's our render layer and here's the composite image. We can go ahead and add an output called the viewer node, and we can drag image to viewer node. And this basically just lets us see our render in the background. If I want to shrink this, I can click this little crosshair in the middle. Let's move it down a little bit. We'll just grab the edge here and we'll just shrink it. Okay, so I positioned the viewer node so it's kind of out of the way and we can see the whole image pretty well. One of the main issues right now is the background and the foreground are rendered together. We can fix this by going over here to View, Layer Properties, and checking Environment. You can see as soon as I check that, a new node appeared right here. However, if I try to view that node, nothing happens. That's because when I make changes to this, I have to re-render, unfortunately. So let's go ahead and do that. Alright guys, so I have just completed the second render, and now, as soon as I hit escape and I went back to my compositor, I left the environment node, plugged in the viewer node, and we can see that it worked. It actually has separated the front of the image from the environment. So this is the background, just the background. The foreground is cut out, and then if I try to look at the foreground, well, they're still combined. So we're kind of halfway there. What we need to do is somehow isolate the foreground from the background so we just have the foreground. To do this, we can go back up to Render Properties. Let's go to Film, and we'll click Transparent. And now we have to re-render again. Alright, so now my render is completed for the third time, and we can see that the background is transparent this time. If I hit Escape, there's my foreground. If I add my environment to the viewer node, there's my background. So now they are separate. The nice thing about this is I can individually edit the environment and the foreground separately. So let's do that. Let's add a color node. Let's add a new node. Let's add a new node. Let's go to color, RGB curves. And let's just adjust this a little bit. See, if I move this up, the background becomes more light. If I move it down, it actually darkens a little bit. Let's go ahead and duplicate the viewer node. And let's attach image to the viewer node. Now we can see the snowman. So we have the snowman, and we have the background. Alright, so now let's go ahead and combine these. Let's add a new node. Let's go to Color, Mix. And I'm going to just drop that off right here. And I'm going to combine the RGB curves from the background to the original image. Let's duplicate this viewer node. Let's attach it to the mix. Let's see what we get. So we have a little bit of an issue. Let's flip these. Okay. So now we can see that we have the snowman in the foreground. Let's change this to add. Now we can see we have our image back together. If I adjust this RGB node right here, you can see the background is still adjusting by itself while the foreground remains the same. Okay, so now you understand why it may be important to use different layers in your rendering. Let's go ahead and try and blur these together just slightly to make it look like it's one image. What we can do is go back to our viewer node for the environment. Let's add a filter blur. I'm going to move this out of the way a little bit, and now let's turn the X value up a bit. Okay, so now we can see the background is blurred. Let's check this viewer again. Let's actually swap this for the original. So now we can see the background is blurred, the foreground's not. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to combine the original background with the blurred background. So let's go ahead and add another mix node. Let's attach the original one with the color modification to the top slot. We'll attach the blur to the bottom slot. Let's duplicate this viewer, and we'll attach that right here. Now let's change this mix mode to, we'll try add, and then let's change the factor down. So what we have is a little bit of blur, but we still have a pretty clear background. We can see the original here, and we can see the new one there. Let's go ahead and combine this with the foreground. Let's see how it looks. So now we can see the blurred background has been added to the foreground. And we have a little bit of blur on the snowman. Let's make this a little bigger so we can see. The edge is not quite as sharp as it was now. There's a little bit of blur over the stick and the sides of the snowman. And actually, one other thing we can do is let's go to Output Split Viewer. And then let's create another mix between the original background and the original foreground. Let's put that in slot 2. And then let's put the new one in slot 1. Let's change that to mix. Let's flip those so it looks right. It should be 0.5. Okay. So this left one is the original and this right one is the new one. If I adjust this, you can see the difference. So I think the only problem now is the whole image is just a little bit too bright, but the snowman does look like it's actually in this image now. So let's go ahead and do one more edit. Let's add color RGB curves right here. Let's copy this viewer node, attach it there. And then let's take the image right here, plug it in to the image node right there, and let's just darken it up a little bit. Just play the node until you like it. All right. When you're done, make sure you take the composite node and attach it to the final output of your node setup, and then re-render. And you see right now it's rendering out our layers separately, but in the very end it'll run through all the compositing for us and combine the image. Alright, so there we go. There is our final image. So it's not perfect, but it's a very good intro to 3D. And you will have created a snowman scene. There's still a lot you can do. But yeah, that's about it for this tutorial. If you like this, go ahead and like, subscribe. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below. Thanks guys, have a good night. Bye.